The piercing ring of my telephone shattered the dead silence of my bedroom at 2 in the morning. I am a 72-year-old retired commercial contractor. At my age, a phone call at that hour never brings good news. I reached over my joints, stiff from decades of working on concrete foundations, and picked up the receiver. A heavy, exhausted voice on the other end identified himself as Sergeant Brody from the Highway Patrol. He told me they had just picked up my 8-year-old grandson wandering alone along the shoulder of Interstate 95. I let out a harsh, confused breath and told the officer that was absolutely impossible. I told him my grandson was fast asleep in the room right next to mine. I even walked over to the open doorway and watched the steady rise and fall of the boy's chest under his blanket to be absolutely certain. I relayed this to the sergeant. The line went completely dead for 3 long seconds. Then the officer lowered his voice to a near whisper and said, I am looking at the child right now, and he has your grandson's exact face." I hung up the phone. I threw on my heavy work boots, grabbed my car keys, and drove out into the freezing rain, having no idea what kind of nightmare I was about to walk into. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to step up and protect a child when the rest of the world turned its back. Your support helps me share these life lessons. The drive to the highway patrol station took 45 minutes, but my mind was racing so fast it felt like hours. The windshield wipers beat back the heavy sheets of rain, but they could not clear the confusion clouding my thoughts. My name is Harrison Mitchell. I have spent my entire life building things from the ground up. I know how to spot a crack in a load-bearing wall, and I know when a structure is about to collapse. But the structure of my own family had been crumbling for years, and I had been turning a blind eye to it. 3 years ago, my son Bradley and his wife Monica drove up to my house in their brand-new imported luxury SUV. They did not come for a Sunday dinner or a holiday visit. They came to drop off their 5-year-old son, Mason. Bradley is a corporate wealth manager in the city, wearing polished suits and talking in buzzwords. Monica comes from Old Money, a family of real estate tycoons from New York who evaluate people based on their net worth. They stood on my front porch, completely detached, and told me they were simply too busy expanding their firm to provide the attention a growing boy needed. They asked if Mason could stay with me for a few months while they stabilized their portfolios. Those few months quietly stretched into 3 entire years. I took the boy in without a second thought. Since my wife Martha passed away, the house had been too quiet anyway. I taught Mason how to fish, how to use a hammer, and how to tell the truth. I provided the warmth his parents never bothered to give. Bradley and Monica sent a generous check every month to cover his expenses, but they rarely visited. When they did, they treated my home like a boarding school and treated me like a hired caretaker. They would stand in my kitchen, checking their expensive watches, looking at my calloused hands with thinly veiled disgust. I swallowed my pride because Mason needed a stable home. But as I gripped the steering wheel of my truck that night, driving through the storm, I felt a deep twisting knot in my gut. My contractor instincts were screaming at me. A child does not just materialize on a highway with my grandson's face. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of the highway patrol station. The neon blue sign flickered in the rain. I turned off the engine and took a deep, steadying breath. I walked through the sliding glass doors, the water dripping from my heavy canvas jacket onto the linoleum floor. The station was quiet, smelling of stale coffee and damp uniforms. Sergeant Brody was waiting for me at the front desk. He was a large man with tired eyes. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply gestured for me to follow him down a narrow, brightly lit hallway. We stopped in front of an observation room. A large pane of two-way glass looked into a small, sterile office. Sergeant Brody crossed his arms and nodded toward the glass. I stepped forward and looked inside. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my chest tighten so hard I thought my 72-year-old heart was finally giving out. Sitting on a metal folding chair was a little boy. He was wrapped in a thick gray wool blanket provided by the paramedics. He was soaked to the bone. His dark hair was matted to his forehead. He was painfully thin, his cheekbones sharp and hollow, his skin pale and shivering. But beneath the dirt and the exhaustion, the face was unmistakable. I pressed my hand against the cold glass. It was not just a passing resemblance. It was not a trick of the lighting. The boy sitting in that chair was the exact absolute mirror image of my grandson Mason. He had the same shape to his jaw, the same spacing of his dark eyes, the same slope of his nose. But the detail that made the blood freeze in my veins was on his left ear. Just below the cartilage there was a tiny crescent-shaped birthmark. It was the exact same mark I had noticed on Mason 100 times while cutting his hair on my back porch. This was not a coincidence. This was biology. I stared at the boy as a female officer offered him a paper cup of warm water. He did not reach for it. He did not speak. His eyes were wide, darting around the room with the frantic, silent terror of a hunted animal. He was trapped in a state of deep, paralyzing shock. I turned to Sergeant Brody. I asked him where they found him. The sergeant explained that a long-haul truck driver had spotted the boy wandering on the shoulder of the highway, miles away from any residential neighborhood. The child had no shoes, no jacket, and no identification. When they brought him in and scanned his fingerprints through the local database for missing children, the system flagged a partial match to my family records, likely from when I registered Mason for a local youth safety program. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I realized I was standing on the edge of a massive, terrifying secret. Bradley and Monica had explicitly told everyone in our family that they only had one child. They had isolated themselves during the pregnancy 8 years ago, claiming they needed privacy for health reasons. I had accepted their boundaries. Now staring at this emaciated, terrified twin brother sitting in a police station in the middle of the night, I knew my son and daughter-in-law had built their glamorous life on a foundation of unimaginable lies. Sergeant Brody handed me a clipboard with a temporary custody release form. He looked at me with a serious, unwavering gaze. He told me the boy was completely mute from trauma and that Child Protective Services would be here in less than an hour to take him into the state ward. He asked me if I was going to claim the child or if I was going to let him disappear into the system. I looked back through the glass at the shivering boy. He was completely alone in the world. I knew that making this decision would tear my family apart. I knew it would start a war with but I am a man who builds shelters for a living, and I was not about to leave my own flesh and blood out in the cold. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and took the pen from the officer's hand. The pen felt heavy in my fingers as I hovered over the dotted line of the temporary custody release form. Sergeant Brody stood beside me waiting for my decision. I did not sign immediately. Instead, I asked if I could step inside the observation room to speak with the boy. Brody unlocked the heavy metal door. I walked in slowly. I pulled up a folding chair and sat right across from him. I am a large man, so I kept my voice low. I introduced myself and asked his name. He did not blink. His dark eyes remained fixed on the floor. I asked how he ended up walking on the highway in a storm, complete silence. The trauma had locked him away, inducing absolute mutism. But sitting this close, my heart hammered against my ribs. The physical resemblance was terrifyingly flawless. Every feature was a perfect mirror image of my grandson Mason, who was asleep in my house miles away. I looked at the crescent-shaped birthmark on his left ear. It was identical. It defied statistical probability. I stood up and told him I would return. I stepped out of the room and pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped my glasses. I dialed the number of my son. It was past 3 in the dark morning. Bradley values his sleep, and waking him up now usually guarantees a lecture about boundaries. He answered on the 3rd ring. His deep voice was thick with sleep and irritation, asking what was so urgent. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him I was at the highway patrol station and that police had found a boy wandering on Interstate 95. I heard Bradley sigh loudly, ready to ask why that was his problem. But before he could speak, I delivered the next sentence. I told him the boy sitting on the other side of the glass had the exact face of Mason, right down to the crescent birthmark on his ear. The silence that followed was not the groggy confusion of a waking man. It was the sharp, deadly silence of a man stepping on a landmine. When Bradley finally spoke, his voice cracked. The irritation was gone, replaced by a raw, unhinged panic I had never heard in his 42 years of life. His very first desperate words, rushed and breathless, demanded to know where exactly I was. I told him the exact name of the station. I could hear rustling in the background and the muffled voice of Monica asking what was going on. Bradley completely ignored her. He told me to step away from the officers, to go outside where no one could hear me. I walked out the sliding glass doors into the freezing rain, standing under the awning. I asked him what was happening, why he was reacting this way to a child who looked exactly like his own son. That is exactly when Bradley delivered his explanation. His voice shifted from panic to a terrifyingly smooth, authoritative tone, the same tone he used when closing massive multi-million-dollar investment deals. He told me to drop the pen and walk out of that station immediately. He claimed this was a highly sophisticated cartel scam that the FBI had been warning wealthy American families about. According to Bradley, international syndicates were using advanced artificial intelligence and facial recognition software to scour local public databases. They would find runaways who bore a striking resemblance to the children of high-net-worth individuals, dress them up, dump them near the location of the target family, and wait for a well-meaning relative to take the bait. He said that once I claimed the child and brought him home, the cartel would use him as leverage to extort our family for millions, threatening to expose us for kidnapping. He sounded certain of the facts, rattling off details about cybersecurity, as if he had been studying it closely for many years. I stood alone in the freezing rain, gripping the phone. Bradley insisted that bringing that boy home would endanger Mason and our entire family. He forcefully ordered me to go back inside, tell the police it was a mistake, and let Child Protective Services take the boy into the state ward. He promised he would book the first flight out of the city and be at my house tomorrow morning to handle the police and the extortionists. He repeatedly told me not to sign anything and to leave the decoy to the authorities. He spoke with such intense conviction that for a fleeting second, the scale of the lie almost washed over me. It genuinely sounded like something out of a modern thriller. But I am an old contractor, and my career was built on recognizing an unstable foundation. As my son breathed heavily on the other end of the line, my gut twisted into a hard knot. Cartels do not leave their assets wandering barefoot on a freezing highway. Cartels do not replicate tiny crescent-shaped birthmarks with absolute perfect biological precision. My wife Martha used to warn me about Bradley. She said he was too smooth, too polished, and entirely too willing to cut moral corners to get ahead. She used to say he could sell a drowning man a glass of water and make him feel grateful. As Bradley listed reasons why I needed to abandon the child, the warning of Martha echoed in my mind. He was trying to manage me. He was containing a situation that terrified him, using fear to manipulate my actions. I did not argue. I knew that arguing with a liar only makes them build better lies. I told him I understood his concerns and hung up the phone without promising anything. The rain continued to pour over the gravel parking lot, but the cold I felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chilling realization that my own grown son was terrified of the existence of this boy. I walked back into the brightly lit police station, my heavy work boots squeaking loudly against the cold, wet floor. I bypassed the waiting area and walked straight to the window. The boy had not moved an inch. He was still staring quietly at this floor, clutching the gray blanket around his fragile shoulders. He looked completely broken by whatever life had subjected him to. The idea of leaving him to be swallowed by the cold, bureaucratic machinery of the state ward made my stomach turn. I walked over to the front desk where Sergeant Brody was waiting. He looked at me, noting the grim determination in my eyes. He tapped the metal clipboard with the tip of his pen, the temporary custody release form still waiting for a signature. The police station was dead quiet save for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Sergeant Brody pushed the clipboard slightly toward me across the counter. He looked at me with a serious, cold, unwavering gaze. "Sir," he asked, his deep voice steady and demanding an immediate answer, "are you claiming this child or not?" I stared at the metal clipboard resting on the cold front desk of the highway patrol station. The printed custody release form glared back at me under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sergeant Brody was waiting for my answer, his heavy hands resting on his duty belt. The warning from my son Bradley echoed repeatedly in my ears. He had just commanded me to walk away, to leave this unknown child to the bureaucratic machinery of Child Protective Services, claiming this was some elaborate and dangerous international extortion scheme. But my contractor instincts were screaming loud and clear. I have spent my entire adult life inspecting structural integrity, and Bradley's story was completely rotten. A highly sophisticated criminal syndicate does not simply drop a perfect genetic duplicate of a wealthy child onto the shoulder of a freezing interstate in the middle of the night without shoes. They do not leave their most valuable asset exposed to the elements or the chance of being hit by a passing commercial truck. They would have safely delivered him to my doorstep with a clear ransom demand. Nothing about his story held any weight. I took a deep breath, picked up the plastic pen, and pressed it firmly against the paper. I ignored the demanding voice of my son ringing in my head and signed my full legal name. Because I was already listed as the registered emergency guardian for Mason, the system allowed me to claim this unidentified boy under my temporary protective care. Sergeant Brody nodded, visibly relieved that he would not have to wake up a state social worker at 4 in the morning. He walked over to the heavy door of the observation room and unlocked it. The small boy flinched backward as the door swung open. I kept my movements incredibly slow and deliberate. I took off my heavy canvas work jacket and draped it gently over his trembling shoulders. He practically disappeared inside the thick, weather-resistant fabric. We walked out of the station together, stepping into the freezing, relentless rain. I opened the passenger door of my truck and lifted his fragile frame onto the seat. He did not utter a single syllable. He pulled his knees up tightly to his chest, staring blankly ahead. I climbed into the driver's seat, cranked the engine, and turned the heater up to its absolute maximum setting. The drive back to my property was hauntingly quiet. The only sounds in the cabin were the rhythmic thudding of the windshield wipers and the harsh blowing of the air vents. Every few minutes I cast a quick glance at him in the dim passing glow of the street lamps. It was exactly like looking at a phantom. He had the exact same slight overbite as Mason. He possessed the identical cowlick on the right side of his hairline. My mind kept violently drifting back to Bradley. Why was my own flesh and blood so desperately terrified of this mute boy? My late wife Martha used to warn me about our son. When Bradley was just a teenager, Martha told me that he viewed human relationships purely as business transactions. She worried deeply that he lacked genuine empathy and was entirely too eager to cut moral corners to advance his own position in life. I had always brushed off her maternal concerns, telling her that the competitive corporate world simply demanded a much harder outer shell. Now gripping the steering wheel while driving through the darkest hour of the night with a child who shared my exact bloodline, I finally realized Martha had recognized the brutal truth long before I ever did. Bradley was not trying to protect our family from a dangerous criminal syndicate. He was frantically attempting to bury a mistake. We finally pulled onto the gravel driveway of my property. The house was completely dark except for the solitary porch light I always kept burning. I walked around the truck and lifted the boy into my arms, carrying him to the front door so his bare feet would not have to touch the freezing, rain-slicked pavement. Once we were safely inside the warm central hallway, I set him down gently. I walked straight to the linen closet and retrieved a stack of thick cotton towels. I guided him toward the guest bathroom, turned on the warm water in the tub, and placed a folded set of Mason's clean pajamas on the counter. I closed the bathroom door to give him a shred of privacy. While he washed away the dirt of the highway, I walked silently down the carpeted hall to check on my grandson. I pushed the door to his bedroom open just a few inches. Mason was still fast asleep, comfortably tangled in his colorful superhero blankets, entirely oblivious to the violent storm raging outside and the identical stranger currently standing in our house. 10 minutes later, the guest bathroom door clicked open. The boy stepped out into the hallway. He was wearing Mason's oversized flannel pajamas, the cuffs rolling past his small hands. His dark hair was towel-dried, but he was still shivering slightly from the lingering shock. Up close, without the mud and the blinding rain, the physical resemblance was even more terrifying to witness. It was not just the rigid biological structure of his face. It was the deeply ingrained mannerisms. I watched as he nervously rubbed his left thumb against the side of his index finger. It was the exact same nervous tick Mason displayed whenever he felt anxious or overwhelmed. I led him into the guest bedroom across the hall, gently pulling back the thick, quilted comforter. He climbed onto the mattress and pulled the heavy covers all the way up to his chin. He watched my every move with wide, terrified eyes. I sat down carefully on the very edge of the bed. I spoke to him in a slow, calming voice. I told him he was completely safe in this house. I promised him that absolutely no one was going to hurt him anymore. I assured him that I would figure everything out as soon as the sun came up. He slowly blinked, his breathing gradually slowing down as pure exhaustion finally dragged him into a deep, dreamless sleep. I quietly stepped out of the room. Less than an hour had passed when a sudden blood-curdling scream shattered the peaceful silence of my home. I sprinted down the hallway and pushed open the guest bedroom door. The boy was thrashing violently against the sheets. He was caught in the grip of a massive night terror, gasping desperately for air. Without thinking, pure instinct took over. I sat beside him and began to softly hum an old obscure melody. It was a lullaby Martha composed herself 30 years ago. It contained no lyrics, just a specific rising and falling tune she used to hum to Bradley when he was an infant. The mute boy suddenly stopped thrashing. He stared directly into my eyes, took a ragged breath, and flawlessly hummed the final 3 notes. Cartel decoys never know secret family lullabies. The truth washed over me in the quiet darkness of the guest bedroom. I slowly stood up from the edge of the mattress, ensuring my heavy work boots made absolutely no sound against the aged wooden floorboards. I pulled the thick quilted comforter a little higher around his fragile shoulders, watching the steady, peaceful rhythm of his breathing. The blinding panic that had gripped him just moments earlier was completely gone, replaced by the deep exhaustion of a child who had finally found a safe harbor. I backed out of the room and softly clicked the door shut. The hallway was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint ambient glow of the security light shining through the front window. I walked past Mason's closed door, my mind reeling with the impossible reality that 2 identical boys were currently sleeping under my roof. I made my way downstairs to the kitchen, intentionally keeping the overhead lights off. I needed the absolute darkness to help me think clearly. I filled a glass with cold tap water and drank it down in one long, desperate gulp, hoping the freezing temperature would shock my system into sharp focus. My gut feeling, the deeply ingrained instinct that had kept me alive on hazardous commercial construction sites for more than 40 years, was screaming louder than ever before. Bradley's desperate phone call kept replaying in my mind on a relentless, maddening loop. His voice had not conveyed the protective fear of a father worried about a potential threat to his family. It had carried the frantic, unhinged panic of a corporate liar whose carefully constructed house of cards was suddenly collapsing in real time. Cartels simply do not abandon valuable leverage on the side of a freezing interstate without demanding a ransom. The entire narrative he had frantically constructed was a massive, desperate fabrication. I leaned heavily against the granite countertop, bracing my weight against the cold stone. I thought about my late wife, Martha. I remembered the exact look of profound sadness in her eyes during her final days in hospice care. She had held my hand, her grip weak, but her words piercingly sharp. She had warned me about Bradley. She told me that our son viewed human lives as expendable assets on a balance sheet. She worried that his relentless pursuit of elite corporate wealth had completely stripped away his moral compass. I had always defended him, arguing that his ruthless ambition was just a necessary tool for survival in the modern financial world. Now, standing alone in my dark kitchen, the brutal truth washed over me. Martha had been absolutely right. Bradley was hiding a monstrous secret. I walked into my home office and sat down in the heavy leather chair behind my desk. I stared blankly at the wall, putting the jagged pieces together. Bradley and Monica had strictly forbidden anyone from visiting the hospital during the pregnancy 8 years ago. They had cited severe medical complications and demanded absolute privacy, completely shutting out the entire family for nearly 2 months. When they finally returned home, they presented Mason as their one and only child. They had maintained that flawless, pristine narrative ever since. But the frail mute boy sleeping upstairs proved that their story was a magnificent, calculated lie. The rebellion within me solidified into cold, unbreakable steel. I was not going to follow Bradley's frantic instructions. I was not going to surrender this terrified child to the cold, unforgiving machinery of the state foster care system. If my son and daughter-in-law had discarded their own flesh and blood to protect their polished high society lifestyle, they were about to face the absolute wrath of a man who had nothing left to lose. I sat in that dark office for the rest of the night, vigilantly watching the clock on the wall tick toward dawn. I did not sleep a single second. I systematically prepared my mind for the inevitable confrontation. I knew Bradley well enough to predict his next move. He would not wait for the afternoon. He would secure the earliest possible private flight and attempt to contain the damage before the local authorities could ask too many questions. I needed to remain perfectly calm. I needed to play the role of the tired, naive old man to lower his guard. I needed him to believe his elaborate lie was working perfectly. The first pale rays of morning light began to filter through the heavy blinds of my office window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, the harsh crunch of heavy tires tearing through the gravel driveway shattered the quiet peace of the neighborhood. I stood up from my desk, my joints stiff from the sleepless night, and walked slowly toward the front foyer. Through the sidelight windows, I watched a black luxury sedan park at a sharp, frantic angle. Bradley and Monica burst out of the vehicle before the engine had even fully shut down. They did not look like concerned parents rushing to ensure the safety of their family. They looked like cornered corporate executives arriving to mitigate a catastrophic disaster. I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open. Bradley pushed past me without offering a single word of greeting. His expensive tailored suit was deeply wrinkled from the frantic overnight travel. Monica followed immediately behind him, her designer trench coat pulled tight around her waist, her posture rigid with an intense, calculated fury. Before I could even attempt to speak a calming word, Monica's sharp eyes darted toward the kitchen hallway. The small, fragile boy, still wearing Mason's oversized flannel pajamas, had wandered out of the guest room. He was standing hesitantly by the doorway, clutching a plastic cup of water. Monica stopped dead in her tracks. She let out a sharp, visceral gasp that echoed loudly through the foyer. Her perfectly manicured facade instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. Without a single second of hesitation, she pointed a trembling finger at the terrified child and screamed at the absolute top of her lungs. "Why the hell did you bring Miles into this house?" The name hung in the damp morning air like a dropped grenade. Miles. Nobody had given the unidentified boy a name yet. The police officers at the highway patrol station had only referred to him as a John Doe. I had not mentioned any name during my brief frantic phone call with Bradley. Monica had just identified him instinctively. I stared at her, locking away my surging rage, and silently absorbed her devastating, monumental mistake. She immediately realized what she had done. She clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute horror. Bradley froze in pure terror. He shot a lethal, venomous glare at his wife, realizing she had just detonated his entire cartel decoy narrative with a single word. But Bradley was a man who made his living navigating high-stakes financial crises. He instantly pivoted, stepping forcefully between me and his wife to block my line of sight. He let out a harsh, artificial laugh, waving his hands in a dismissive gesture. "Dad, you have to excuse Monica," he said, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet manufactured calm. She is completely exhausted and hysterical from the flight." When she saw the boy wearing Mason's old pajamas, her mind just snapped back to that old golden retriever we used to have. "You remember our dog Miles, right? She is just confused and terrified because you brought this dangerous decoy into the house after I explicitly told you not to." It was a pathetic, scrambling lie. They had never owned a dog named Miles. Monica despised animals. But I did not challenge him. I let my shoulders slump forward deliberately, transforming my posture into that of a tired, confused old man who could no longer keep up with the fast-paced world. I rubbed my eyes heavily and nodded slowly, murmuring a quiet apology. I told them I was just overwhelmed by the storm and the heavy police presence, and that I thought I was doing the right thing by giving the poor child a warm bed for the night. I watched the immense, palpable relief wash over Bradley's face. He truly believed his flimsy excuse had worked perfectly. He believed I was too old and foolish to see through the massive cracks in his story. Bradley immediately took complete control of the room, reverting to his authoritative, commanding tone. He declared that they were ending this dangerous situation right now. He stated that they were taking Mason back to their secure penthouse in the city, immediately away from this supposed cartel threat. He forcefully instructed me to call Child Protective Services and hand the decoy over to the state, exactly as he had demanded the night before. He warned me that if I complicated the matter any further, he would cut off all contact between me and Mason for the foreseeable future. I nodded submissively, playing my part to absolute perfection. I told him I would go upstairs and help Mason pack his overnight bags. I slowly climbed the wooden staircase, my heart pounding with a fierce, protective resolve. I walked into Mason's room and found my grandson sitting up in bed, rubbing his sleepy eyes, completely unaware of the monstrous deception unfolding right beneath his floorboards. I told him his parents were here to take him home for a little while. I helped him fold his clothes and pack his small duffel bag. As I gathered his belongings, I executed the first crucial step of my secret counterattack. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, circular tracking device I used to keep on my keyring. I slipped the tracker deep inside the inner lining of Mason's heavy winter jacket, pressing it firmly into the bottom seam, where neither Bradley nor Monica would ever think to check. Then I picked up Mason's hairbrush from the wooden dresser. I carefully pulled several strands of his dark hair from the bristles, ensuring the roots were fully intact, and slipped them into a clear plastic bag in my pocket. I already had the second biological sample I needed retrieved earlier from the pillow the other boy had slept on. I walked Mason downstairs to the foyer, carrying his duffel bag. Bradley and Monica were standing by the front door, deeply impatient, and completely refusing to look toward the kitchen, where the mute boy remained hidden. I knelt down on this hardwood floor and pulled Mason into a tight, lingering embrace. I whispered in his ear, promising him that everything was going to be absolutely fine, and that I loved him more than anything in this entire world. I stood up and handed the heavy bag directly to Bradley. He gave me a curt, dismissive nod and practically shoved his family out the front door, absolutely desperate to escape the house and the consequences hiding inside it. I stood in the silent doorway and watched their luxury sedan speed aggressively away down the wet road, throwing a heavy spray of muddy water into the ditch. The very moment they finally and completely disappeared from my sight, the fragile, confused old man vanished forever. I pulled the plastic bags from my pocket, gripped them tightly in my calloused hand, and firmly grabbed my heavy winter coat from the rack. I stepped back into the quiet warmth of the house, just as the doorbell rang for a second time that morning. It was a social worker from Child Protective Services, flanked by a uniformed officer. Bradley had demanded I make the call, and I had complied, knowing it was the only way to convince my son that I was following his strict, frantic instructions. The social worker was a kind woman with tired eyes. She gently coaxed the mute, terrified boy out of the kitchen. He clung to the oversized flannel pajamas, looking back at me with an expression of profound betrayal. It took every ounce of restraint in my 72-year-old body not to physically block the door and fight them off. I forced my shoulders to slump, playing the defeated, helpless grandfather. I knelt down to his eye level and gave him a brief, reassuring nod, silently promising him that I was not abandoning him to the cold machinery of the state ward. I watched through the window as they strapped him into the back of a sterile white government vehicle and drove away. The house was finally entirely empty. The silence that settled over the rooms was incredibly heavy, completely suffocating. I walked back into my home office and securely locked the door behind me. I sat down heavily at my desk and pulled my tablet from the top drawer. I tapped the screen to open the tracking application linked to the small device I had discreetly slipped into the lining of the winter jacket belonging to Mason. The digital map illuminated my face with a harsh, bright glow. A small green dot pulsated on the screen, moving steadily along the northbound interstate. They were currently 30 miles away, traveling fast. I set the tablet down and pulled the 2 clear plastic bags from my coat pocket. Inside the first bag were the strands of dark hair I had pulled directly from the wooden hairbrush belonging to Mason just an hour earlier. Inside the second bag were the loose hairs I had carefully gathered from the white pillowcase in the guest bedroom where the mysterious boy had slept. I placed them side by side on the dark leather surface of my desk. I stared at the biological evidence, fully realizing that whatever the results showed my family would never be the same again. I grabbed my truck keys and a thick, heavy envelope of emergency cash I kept locked in a fireproof safe. I drove straight into the grittiest, most run-down industrial district of the city. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and smelling of wet asphalt and motor oil. I parked in front of a dilapidated brick building that housed a failing bail bonds business on the ground floor. I bypassed the front entrance and walked down a narrow, dimly lit alleyway to a reinforced steel door at the back. This was the highly discreet office of Victor Cole. Victor was a cynical, no-nonsense private investigator I had retained several times over the decades to perform extensive background checks on fraudulent commercial contractors. He was a man who operated entirely in the shadows, unburdened by standard bureaucratic procedures. I knocked on the metal door using a specific rhythmic sequence we established years ago. Victor opened the door. He looked older and more exhausted than the last time I saw him, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt and holding a mug of black coffee. He asked no pointless questions. He simply stepped aside and let me enter the cramped, windowless office. The room was cluttered with towering stacks of manila folders, humming computer servers, and the sharp, lingering smell of cheap tobacco. I walked straight to his battered metal desk and slammed the 2 clear plastic bags containing the hair samples down onto the scratched surface. I tossed the thick envelope of cash right next to them. Victor looked at the money and then up at my face, instantly recognizing the dangerous intensity burning in my eyes. I told him I needed an expedited confidential DNA comparison completed by a private laboratory. I told him I did not care what federal regulations he had to bypass, or how much extra money it would cost to skip the line. I needed the genetic results back in my hands in less than 48 hours. Victor picked up the bags, examining the dark strands of hair against the harsh glow of his desk lamp. He asked me what exactly we were looking for. I told him I suspected my son and daughter-in-law were hiding a massive, monstrous secret, and that these two distinct samples might belong to identical twins. Victor raised an eyebrow quietly, absorbing the severe implications of my statement. He locked the samples securely inside a small refrigerated safe behind his desk. He promised me the results would be prioritized immediately. I pulled my tablet from my jacket and set it on the desk between us. I tapped the screen, bringing up the live tracking software that was actively monitoring the digital dot moving across the state map. I explained that my grandson Mason was currently in the vehicle, represented by that green dot, along with my son Bradley and his wife Monica. I told Victor that Bradley claimed he was terrified of a sophisticated international cartel and had forcefully insisted they were retreating straight to their highly secured luxury penthouse in the center of the financial district to wait out the threat. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the cluttered desk, and narrowed his eyes at the glowing screen. He typed a few rapid commands into his own high-powered computer terminal, linking my tracking data to a much more advanced satellite mapping program. He brought up a highly detailed live topographical view of the exact area where the green dot was currently traveling. The silent tension in the cramped office thickened as we both watched the progress of the vehicle. The digital marker was moving rapidly, but it was absolutely nowhere near the primary highway exits that led toward the downtown financial district. Instead, the dot suddenly veered off the main interstate, taking a remote, poorly maintained service road that led far away from the city center. I asked Victor where that specific rural road led. His fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up property records and zoning permits for the isolated area. The satellite image zoomed in tightly on the final destination. My heart stopped completely as the terrifying reality of their true destination materialized on the large monitor. Bradley and Monica were not driving home to safely hide in their luxury penthouse. They were speeding directly toward a private, unlisted corporate airfield, hidden on the barren outskirts of the county. The implications of this sudden detour were absolutely devastating. They were not seeking safety from an imaginary cartel. They were actively attempting to flee the state jurisdiction before anyone could ask questions. I stared at the glowing monitor as the green dot finally came to a complete halt right beside a designated private runway. My blood ran completely cold. I looked at Victor, frozen. The very heavy silence in his cramped office was broken only by the low hum of his computer servers. My son was running. He was fleeing the state on a private aircraft rather than answering a single question about the child I had harbored in my home. I wanted to drive straight to that airfield and physically drag him out of the fuselage. But Victor placed a steady, reassuring hand on my shoulder. He told me that confronting Bradley right now without concrete, undeniable evidence would only force him deeper into hiding. We needed the genetic results before we launched any kind of offensive strike. I slowly nodded, forcing my raging emotions back into a cold, disciplined box. I left his office and drove back to my empty house, fully aware that the next 72 hours would be the longest, most agonizing wait of my entire life. 3 days passed in absolute suffocating silence. I paced the hardwood floors of my home, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything except the haunting image of that fragile boy being transported in the back of a state vehicle. I felt a profound, sickening guilt for letting Child Protective Services take him away, even though I knew it was the only way to maintain my cover with Bradley. I kept my phone constantly by my side, waiting for Victor to call. During those endless, agonizing hours, my mind continuously drifted back 8 years into the past, carefully re-examining the events surrounding the birth of my grandson. I recalled the exact moment Bradley had called me to announce that Monica was pregnant. The news had brought immense joy to my late wife, Martha. But their behavior during the pregnancy had been highly unusual, deeply secretive, and aggressively guarded. Bradley and Monica had explicitly told our entire family that they were expecting a single baby boy. They had never once mentioned the possibility of twins. As the due date approached, they abruptly isolated themselves from everyone. When Monica finally went into labor, Bradley strictly banned all visitors from the hospital. He claimed that there were sudden severe post-birth complications and that the medical staff required absolute quarantine protocols. We were forced to wait nearly 2 full months before they finally allowed us to visit their penthouse. When we arrived, they presented a perfectly healthy, thriving infant named Mason. They firmly shut down any questions regarding the supposed medical complications. I had accepted their boundaries out of respect for their privacy. Now looking back through the lens of this terrifying new reality, their extreme isolation did not look like protective parenting. It looked exactly like a highly calculated, meticulously executed cover-up. On the afternoon of the third day, my phone finally vibrated violently on the kitchen counter. I snatched it up before the second ring. Victor did not bother with a greeting. He simply told me to get down to his office immediately. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my truck, and sped back to the industrial district, my heart pounding a relentless rhythm against my ribs. I practically ripped the heavy steel door open and stepped into his dimly lit workspace. Victor was sitting behind his scratched desk, holding a crisp white manila folder. He did not look triumphant. He looked deeply disturbed, a rare expression for a man who made his living navigating the darkest corners of human deception. I walked over and stood directly in front of him. I asked him what the laboratory had found. Victor did not say a word. He simply slid the official stamped forensic report across the desk. I picked up the thick paper, my hands trembling slightly as my eyes scanned the complex scientific data. I bypassed the medical jargon and looked straight at the final highlighted conclusion at the bottom of the document. The biological samples I had provided from the 2 boys were a 99.9% genetic match. They were monozygotic identical twins. It was scientifically absolutely undeniable. The boy I had found shivering at the highway patrol station was my own flesh and blood. He was the exact same age as Mason. He shared the exact same DNA. He was the child my son had desperately tried to convince me was a highly sophisticated cartel decoy. I lowered the paper, feeling an intense wave of nausea wash over me. I asked Victor how an entire human being could simply be erased from existence without a single medical professional or government official raising an alarm. I asked him how Bradley and Monica could have hidden a second child from the world for 8 entire years. Victor leaned back in his squeaking leather chair, took a slow sip of his black coffee, and looked at me with a grim, hardened expression. He explained that a private investigator is only as good as the digital doors he is willing to kick down. He told me that while we were waiting for the genetic laboratory to process the samples, he had actively deployed a highly illegal, invasive tracking program to quietly bypass the heavily encrypted security firewalls of the specific private hospital where Monica had given birth 8 years ago. He knew that physical records could be destroyed, but deep digital footprints were nearly impossible to completely erase. Victor told me he had spent the last 48 hours digging through restricted archived medical databases searching for any anomalies matching Monica's admission dates. He had sifted through thousands of redacted files and surgical logs. He said it took a massive amount of effort, but he had finally breached a hidden localized server containing the original unaltered birth records from that specific week. I stood frozen, gripping the edge of his desk, as Victor reached out and slowly spun his large computer monitor around so I could clearly see the screen. The glowing display showed a highly confidential, unredacted hospital birth certificate. I leaned in closer, my eyes darting across the digital document. The names Bradley Caldwell and Monica Caldwell were clearly printed under the parent section. But the patient section did not list a single child. It listed 2 distinct separate births, recorded exactly 14 minutes apart. The first name printed on the document was Mason Alexander Caldwell. The second name printed right below it on the very same official hospital record was Miles Harrison Caldwell. They had given the second boy my exact first name as his middle name. The room started to spin. The truth was completely staggering. Monica really had given birth to twins. They had named him Miles, The boy had possessed a name this entire time and an identity that connected him directly to me. I reached out to touch the monitor, tracing the letters of his name, feeling an agonizing sorrow for the 8 years he had spent lost in the dark. But as my eyes moved across the rest of the digital document, my sorrow instantly morphed into a sharp, terrifying confusion. Right next to the name Miles Harrison Caldwell, illuminating the otherwise sterile black and white digital record, was a bright flashing red medical flag. I stared at the crimson warning symbol, feeling a cold, suffocating dread rising from the pit of my stomach. Victor did not hesitate. His fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a rapid series of complex commands to break through the secondary layer of digital encryption, protecting the specific pediatric files attached to that warning flag. The screen flickered for a brief moment before a dense multi-page medical dossier populated the monitor. It was filled with highly complex cardiological terminology, surgical schedules, and intensive care unit transfer logs, dating back to the exact week my grandsons were born. I stood frozen behind Victor, my eyes desperately scanning the dense paragraphs of medical jargon, struggling to comprehend the sheer volume of clinical data. Victor leaned closer to the screen, his hardened face reflecting the pale light of the monitor, as he began to translate the cold medical reality into plain, devastating English. He told me that while Mason had been born perfectly healthy, his identical twin brother Miles had suffered a catastrophic genetic anomaly during development. The medical records clearly outlined a severe, incredibly rare congenital heart defect. The structural abnormalities in his small heart were so extensive that the pediatric surgeons had noted an extremely high probability of neonatal mortality without immediate, highly invasive intervention. Victor scrolled down through the operational logs, his voice steady but carrying a heavy, undeniable weight. He explained that within the first 48 hours of his life, little Miles had already endured 2 massive open-heart surgeries just to stabilize his fragile cardiovascular system. But the surgical interventions were only a temporary, desperate measure. The detailed prognosis from the chief of pediatric cardiology was absolutely brutal. Miles was going to require a continuous, lifelong regimen of highly specialized, experimental medical treatments, a permanent rotation of intensive care, monitoring, and eventually a highly complex heart transplant to simply survive past his toddler years. The sheer scale of the medical tragedy was overwhelming, but the subsequent financial documents attached to the dossier revealed a much darker, much more sinister reality. Victor opened a separate digital folder containing the hospital billing records and insurance communications from that first agonizing year. He pointed to a series of denied claims and rejected coverage appeals. The experimental nature of the required treatments, combined with the astronomical, staggering costs of the specialized surgeries, had rapidly exhausted the lifetime limits of Bradley and Monica's premium corporate health insurance policies. The out-of-pocket medical expenses were projected to climb into the millions of dollars within the first 2 years alone. Victor looked up at me, his cynical eyes confirming the horrific truth I was just beginning to realize. The relentless financial burden of keeping Miles alive was a guaranteed, absolute death sentence for the polished, elite lifestyle Bradley and Monica had so ruthlessly constructed. I leaned heavily against the back of Victor's chair, my lungs burning as I struggled to draw a full breath. A torrential wave of pure, unadulterated grief washed over me, instantly followed by a blinding, white-hot rage. I was a successful commercial contractor. I had spent 40 years building a substantial, highly secure financial foundation for my family. If Bradley had simply picked up the phone and told me the truth, if he had just asked for my help, I would have liquidated every single asset I owned. I would have sold my property, drained my entire retirement portfolio, and worked until my calloused hands literally bled to pay those medical bills. I would have moved mountains to save the life of my grandson. But Bradley never made that call. He never asked for my help, because asking for help meant publicly admitting a flaw in his perfect, pristine corporate image. He and Monica did not want a severely ill child draining their flawless high society reputation. They viewed their own fragile son not as a child to be loved and fiercely protected, but as a catastrophic financial liability that needed to be ruthlessly eliminated from their balance sheet. I demanded to know what happened next. I asked Victor how a severely ill child requiring constant medical supervision simply vanished into thin air after his first year of life. If Miles had tragically succumbed to his heart condition, there would be a death certificate. There would be a recorded burial or a cremation record. But there was absolutely nothing. The hospital records simply stopped abruptly right around his first birthday. I slammed my hand down on the metal desk, the loud impact echoing sharply in the small windowless office. I ordered Victor to expand his digital search far beyond the localized hospital databases. I told him to hack into the state child protective services networks, the foster care tracking systems, and every single law enforcement database in the surrounding states. I needed him to specifically search for any unidentified male infants, matching the exact physical and medical description of Miles, focusing the search parameters on a time frame exactly 7 years ago. Victor did not say a word. He immediately initiated a massive cross-state algorithmic search, deploying specialized software designed to scan hundreds of thousands of restricted governmental records simultaneously. The computer servers in the corner of his office hummed loudly as the program sifted through years of forgotten buried data. We stood in agonizing silence for nearly 20 minutes, watching the progress bar slowly creep across the monitor. Suddenly, the screen flashed, indicating a high probability match. Victor clicked on the notification, pulling up a scanned, heavily redacted police report from a rural jurisdiction in a neighboring state more than 300 miles away from the hospital where the twins were born. I stared at the digitized police report, my heart shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces as the monstrous reality of their actions finally came into perfect agonizing focus. The report detailed an incident that occurred late on a freezing night exactly 7 years ago. A 1-year-old baby boy suffering from severe visible respiratory distress and matching the precise medical profile of my grandson had been found completely alone in a car seat on the concrete steps of a remote, unstaffed fire station. He had been anonymously abandoned under the strict legal protections of the Safe Haven Law, a specific statute meticulously designed to allow desperate, impoverished parents to legally surrender newborn infants to the authority of the state without facing subsequent criminal prosecution. Bradley and Monica had intentionally driven across state lines in the dead of night to dispose of their critically sick child, like a piece of broken, unwanted furniture. They had callously dumped a desperately ill baby directly into the overwhelmed, severely underfunded state ward system, fully assuming he would quietly pass away among complete strangers. This horrific, calculated maneuver left them free to return to their luxury penthouse and their millions without a single trace of personal guilt, completely escaping any long-term financial burden. They threw away their sick child to save their extravagant lifestyle. I sat perfectly still in the cramped windowless office of Victor Cole, staring blankly at the glowing computer monitor. The digital police report from 7 years ago remained illuminated on the screen, documenting the exact moment my son and his wife had driven across state lines to abandon their critically ill infant at an unstaffed fire station. My chest heaved with a sickening mixture of profound grief and boiling rage. But as the initial shock slowly began to recede, the analytical side of my brain took over. I spent 40 years working as a commercial contractor, a job requiring you to constantly look for structural inconsistencies. When a building fails, there is always a foundational reason. And right now, the foundation of Bradley and Monica's monstrous lie was showing a massive, glaring, logical gap. I turned away from the monitor and began to pace the narrow length of the office. The floorboards creaked under my heavy boots as I voiced my thoughts aloud. If Bradley and Monica had utilized a legal loophole to surrender Miles to the state ward system, completely absolving themselves of any future medical or financial responsibility, why did they need to completely erase his existence from our family history? They could have simply told everyone that the second twin had tragically passed away during those secretive weeks in the hospital. People would have mourned, offered their deepest sympathies, and eventually moved on. Or they could have claimed that the overwhelming medical needs were too much. They could have made the agonizing choice to give him to a specialized facility. It would have been a shameful admission, but it would not have required a lifetime of elaborate paranoid secrecy. Instead, they chose the most difficult, highly dangerous path possible. They entirely falsified a single pregnancy. They went to extreme, paranoid lengths to ensure that absolutely no one in our family ever knew that a second boy had been born. A deception of that massive magnitude requires constant, exhausting maintenance. People do not exert that kind of relentless effort just to avoid a little social embarrassment. They do it because there is a massive financial incentive attached to the lie. My mind immediately shifted to Monica's family. I thought about her late father, Richard Sterling. Richard had been a ruthless, domineering real estate tycoon in New York. He built a billion-dollar empire by crushing his competitors and discarding anyone he deemed a liability. I had only met the man a handful of times at awkward holiday dinners, but I remembered him vividly. He was a cold, calculating man who openly despised physical weakness. He believed that illness was a severe moral failing always. He believed that only the strong deserved to inherit his legacy. Richard had suffered a massive, fatal stroke just 2 months before the twins were born. His sudden death had thrown Monica into a brief, frantic panic, not out of grief for her father, but out of desperate concern for how his massive estate would be divided among his notoriously greedy heirs. The timing was entirely too precise to be a mere coincidence. Richard died, the heavily guarded estate went into probate, and shortly after Bradley and Monica locked themselves away, emerging with only one healthy child returning. They buried the sick one in another state. I stopped pacing and looked directly at Victor. I told him that we were no longer just looking at a case of child abandonment. We were looking at a highly coordinated multi-million-dollar financial fraud. I explained my theory about Richard Sterling and the timing of his death. Victor nodded slowly, his cynical mind immediately connecting the same dark dots. He told me that investigating a private, high-net-worth estate was far beyond his typical street-level surveillance capabilities. He could hack hospital records and trace license plates perfectly. But breaching the fortified legal walls of a billionaire's post-mortem financial trust required a completely different kind of weapon. We needed someone who spoke the language of corporate greed. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had not called in over a decade. I called Jonathan Blake. Jonathan was a ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney I had previously hired to destroy a corrupt supplier who tried to bankrupt my construction firm in the late 90s. Jonathan was not a man burdened by gentle morals. He was a legal shark who specialized in tearing apart contracts. He spent his career exposing hidden offshore accounts. I knew that if anyone could penetrate the fortified walls of the Sterling family estate, it was him. He answered the phone with his usual crisp, impatient tone. I did not waste time with small talk. I told him I needed to urgently audit the closed estate of Richard Sterling, and that I suspected my son was utilizing a dead man's money to finance a massive criminal deception. Jonathan remained silent for a moment, clearly intrigued by the sheer audacity of the accusation. He told me to meet him fast. He told me to be at his downtown office in exactly 1 hour. I thanked Victor for his invaluable work, grabbed the manila folder containing the DNA results and the hacked birth certificates, and rushed out the heavy steel door. I drove straight to the towering glass skyscraper, where Jonathan occupied a massive corner office on the top floor. I walked past the elegant reception desk, my worn canvas jacket drawing confused looks from the polished legal assistants. Jonathan was waiting for me behind his sleek mahogany desk. He looked exactly the same as I remembered, extremely sharp. I was unblinking and entirely focused on the bottom line. I sat down and laid out the entire story, from the 2 a.m. phone call to the horrific discovery of the safe haven drop-off. I handed him the physical evidence. I explained my theory regarding Monica's late father and the suspicious timing of the isolated birth. Jonathan listened to every single word without interrupting. His eyes scanned the digital printouts, his sharp legal mind instantly processing the massive implications of the genetic match and the hidden medical flags. When I finished speaking, he leaned back completely. He sat silently in his expensive leather chair and steepled his fingers together. He told me my instincts were absolutely correct. He explained that ultra-wealthy individuals like Richard Sterling rarely leave their fortunes in simple, straightforward wills. They lock their assets inside complex generational trust funds, designed with incredibly demanding, highly specific stipulations to control their descendants from beyond the grave. Jonathan immediately turned to his computer and began typing rapidly, searching through heavily restricted financial archives. After 20 agonizing minutes, he stopped. He turned his wide, glowing monitor around, revealing a highly classified document. He looked directly into my tired eyes and stated confidently that he had successfully found a heavily guarded, incredibly specific generational trust fund. Jonathan reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavily bound stack of legal paperwork. He dropped the 500-page trust document directly onto the center of his desk. The heavy thud echoed sharply in this quiet office. He pushed the imposing stack of papers toward me, tapping the thickest section with his index finger. I explained that Richard Sterling was an incredibly paranoid and controlling billionaire who possessed absolutely zero faith in his daughter Monica or her husband Bradley. Richard had viewed Bradley as nothing more than a polished corporate parasite, and he had viewed his own daughter as a reckless, irresponsible socialite who would inevitably squander the family fortune. Because of this deep-seated contempt, Richard had structured his massive estate to entirely bypass Monica and Bradley. He did not leave them a single dollar of liquid capital. Instead, he funneled the vast majority of his wealth into an ironclad, fiercely protected generational trust fund, explicitly designed to benefit only his direct grandchildren. I stared at the daunting pile of legal jargon, my mind struggling to grasp the sheer magnitude of what Jonathan was telling me. I asked him how this specific trust connected to the abandonment of my grandson. Jonathan opened the thick binder to a specific highlighted page and turned it around so I could read the dense paragraphs. He explained that while the principal billions were strictly locked away until the grandchildren reached the age of 25, Richard had included a very specific maintenance and education clause. This clause was designed to ensure that his heirs were raised in absolute elite luxury. The trust was legally mandated to pay out a staggering $500,000 annually for the direct care and upbringing of every single living, breathing grandchild. Jonathan looked at me, letting the sheer weight of that massive number settle into the quiet room. $500,000 every single year per child, completely tax-free. I sat back in my chair, feeling the blood drain completely from my face as the horrific calculated mathematics of their deception finally became clear. If Bradley and Monica had only presented Mason to the world, claiming a tragic complication, had claimed the second twin, they would have legally collected $500,000 every year. That was certainly a massive amount of money, but it apparently was not enough to satisfy their insatiable corporate greed. By intentionally hiding the severe medical condition of little Miles, and by quietly abandoning him across state lines, instead of officially declaring him deceased or formally surrendered, they successfully kept his legal identity completely alive on paper. They maintained the flawless illusion that they were raising two perfectly healthy, thriving boys. Because Miles was still legally recognized as a living descendant of the Sterling bloodline, the Generational Trust Fund was obligated to release a second identical stipend. They were collecting a cool $1 million every single year. Over the course of the past 7 years, my son and his ruthless wife had quietly siphoned $3.5 million from the grandfather's estate, solely based on the documented existence of the very child they had discarded at a rural fire station. They kept his legal name alive strictly to farm his massive trust fund allocation. I leaned forward and asked Jonathan how they managed to pull off such a massive, long-term financial deception without drawing the immediate attention of the federal government or the Internal Revenue Service. I knew that trusts of this enormous magnitude were fiercely audited and monitored by highly paid legal teams. Jonathan nodded, an expression of grim professional respect crossing his sharp features. He explained that Richard Sterling had been notoriously paranoid about financial fraud during his lifetime. The billionaire had explicitly anticipated that someone might try to exploit the trust fund after his death. To completely prevent any unauthorized siphoning of the estate, Richard had aggressively implemented a stringent, unbreakable fail-safe mechanism within the core structure of the legal documents. He demanded absolute, undeniable proof of life. Jonathan flipped to another highlighted section of the massive document. He translated the dense legal phrasing into a chilling, inescapable reality. The executors of the Sterling estate, a rigid, highly suspicious board of senior corporate attorneys based in a towering New York financial firm, were legally forbidden from releasing the annual distribution checks based solely on written affidavits, emailed photographs, or signed medical forms. They required a mandatory scheduled, in-person annual audit. Every single year, without exception, the parents were required to physically travel to the New York office and present the living, breathing grandchildren directly to the board of executors. The attorneys needed to physically see the boys with their own eyes, ask them directly about their schooling and their continuous health and well-being, and verify their identities before authorizing the massive transfer of the $1 million stipend into their guardian accounts. I stared at Jonathan, my mind instantly hitting a massive, insurmountable logical brick wall. The devastating information he had just revealed created a completely impossible contradiction. My chest tightened as I rapidly processed the strict parameters of the billionaire's trust fund, fail-safe. I slowly articulated the glaring problem aloud, my voice echoing hollowly in the large executive office, noting every single detail. If the ironclad rules of the trust fund explicitly mandated that both boys must be physically present in a New York boardroom every single year to secure the massive financial distribution, the entire criminal scheme should have collapsed instantly on the very first day. The undeniable reality was that little Miles had been anonymously surrendered under the safe haven law exactly 7 years ago. He had spent his entire conscious life trapped inside a sterile, underfunded state ward facility located more than 300 miles away from his polished, wealthy parents. He had absolutely no idea who his biological family was, and he had certainly never traveled to a high-rise corporate law firm in Manhattan to attend a scheduled financial review. If the terrified mute boy I had rescued from the freezing highway patrol station had been locked away in a distant public foster home for his entire childhood, completely severed from his biological identity, how, in the absolute world, had Bradley and Monica been successfully passing the strict in-person annual audits to collect that second $500,000 check every single year? The impossibility of this massive deception paralyzed my thoughts. They managed to achieve a flawless illusion, and I needed to understand exactly how. I stared at the monitor, the sheer weight of Jonathan's discovery settling over me. A trust fund that demanded physical in-person verification every single year. Before Jonathan could elaborate on the legal mechanisms, the heavy oak door of the office swung open. Victor Cole stepped inside. He had not waited at his downtown desk. He had continued digging through the digital footprints following the massive money trail straight to the corporate headquarters. Victor walked over to the mahogany desk, his worn boots a stark contrast to the elite surroundings. He did not say a single word. He unclasped a thick leather folder and began spreading surveillance photographs across the wooden surface. I leaned forward, hands resting on the edge of the desk, and looked down at the glossy images. They were security camera snapshots extracted from the lobby of a towering financial building in New York. Each photograph was time-stamped in the bottom right corner, documenting exactly 1 day a year for the past 5 consecutive years. I focused intensely on the very first image. It showed Bradley and Monica walking through the grand marble lobby. Walking perfectly between them, holding their hands, was my grandson Mason. He was wearing a distinct bright blue knitted sweater. Victor pointed a scarred finger at the timestamp. It read 9 in the morning. He then slid a second photograph directly next to the first. This image was taken in the exact same lobby, from the exact same camera angle, just 45 minutes later. Bradley and Monica were standing near the public restrooms. Walking out of the men's room holding Bradley's hand was a little boy. He possessed the exact same facial structure, height, and dark hair. But this boy was wearing a dark green corduroy jacket and thick wire-rimmed prescription glasses. My breath caught sharply in my throat as the monstrous, sickening reality finally clicked into place. I looked at Victor, then at Jonathan, my mind desperately trying to reject the sheer depravity of what I was seeing. They had not been presenting two different children to the board of executors. They had been using Mason to play both roles. Every single year, my son and his wife would fly to New York with their one healthy child. They would march him into that high-rise boardroom, wearing his blue sweater, present him to the attorneys as Mason, and sign the first stack of legal documents to secure the initial $500,000 distribution. Then, under the guise of a bathroom break, they would take him down the hall. Inside a public restroom, they would strip off his blue sweater, force him into a completely different outfit, slide fake prescription glasses onto his face, and march him right back into that same boardroom to masquerade as his discarded twin brother. They used my grandson as a living prop to steal an additional $500,000 every single year. The profound psychological abuse inflicted on Mason was completely unimaginable to me. They were actively forcing a young, highly impressionable boy to participate in a massive federal fraud without him ever understanding the gravity of his actions. To Mason, it was probably just a strange, confusing game his parents made him play once a year in a big city. He had no idea he was putting on a costume to impersonate the brother he never knew existed. They had dumped a critically sick infant at a rural fire station to dodge his overwhelming medical bills, leaving him to rot in an underfunded state ward. Yet they meticulously kept his legal identity alive, actively exploiting his twin brother's face to systematically extract millions of dollars from the grandfather's estate. Over the course of 7 years, my son and his ruthless wife had quietly siphoned $3.5 million using this exact deceptive method. It was a level of cold, psychopathic greed that absolutely defied human comprehension. I felt a violent, sickening wave of disgust wash over me. I had spent my entire life working with my hands, building honest structures, and trying to instill basic moral decency into my son. To discover that he was capable of monetizing the very existence of a discarded child made me question every single thing I thought I knew about him. He was financing his luxury vehicles, his tailored suits, and his pristine penthouse using the stolen inheritance of a sick boy he threw away like garbage. The absolute cruelty of keeping the legal identity alive solely for profit, while abandoning the actual human being to suffer alone in the foster system, was unforgivable. My fists clenched so tightly, my knuckles turned completely white. I looked at the surveillance photographs again, staring at the innocent face of Mason, wearing those fake prescription glasses. I swore right then and there that I would absolutely tear their fraudulent empire down to the foundation. Jonathan tapped his expensive silver pen against the edge of the desk, drawing my attention back to the current timeline. He pulled up the official probate calendar on his computer monitor and highlighted a specific date in bright yellow. He explained that the annual mandatory in-person audit for the Sterling estate was not a random occurrence. It was scheduled for a very precise window every single year to ensure strict compliance. Jonathan looked at me with a grim, razor-sharp intensity. He stated that the next mandatory audit was scheduled to take place in New York this coming Friday. We had less than 48 hours before Bradley and Monica attempted to walk into that boardroom with Mason to steal another $1 million. The timing was incredibly narrow. We were standing on the absolute brink of their next massive criminal transaction. I stared at the monitor in Jonathan Blake's office, the sheer weight of the double-life deception settling heavily over me. My son had been using his own child as a prop to steal millions. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the harsh vibration of my cell phone against the mahogany desk. I looked down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed Bradley's name. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind remained perfectly clear. I picked up the device and pressed the button to answer, raising the speaker to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply waited for him to speak first. The voice that came through the receiver was not the smooth, polished tone of a successful corporate manager. It was the frantic, venomous snarl of a man who had just realized his walls were caving in. Bradley did not offer a greeting. He immediately launched into a vicious, breathless tirade. He demanded to know what exactly I thought I was doing. He told me he had just unpacked Mason's winter jacket and found the small circular tracking device hidden deep inside the bottom seam. He accused me of spying on his family, of overstepping my bounds as a grandfather, and of acting like a paranoid, senile old fool. He asked me if I really thought I could outsmart him by slipping a cheap piece of plastic into a child's luggage. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, listening to the desperate vitriol pouring out of my only son. I looked across the desk at Jonathan and Victor. Both men were watching me with quiet, focused intensity. I kept my breathing slow and measured. I let Bradley yell. He was terrified. He knew that if I had planted a tracker, I had likely discovered his sudden flight to the private corporate airfield instead of the downtown penthouse. He knew his cartel decoy story was falling apart at the seams. But instead of confessing or asking for forgiveness, Bradley doubled down. He chose absolute, unyielding aggression. He shifted to a tone of pure, calculated malice. He laid out a series of brutal ultimatums, treating me not as his father, who had housed and raised his son for the past 3 years, but as a hostile corporate rival that needed to be ruthlessly crushed. He told me that if I did not back off immediately, he was going to destroy my life. He promised to contact the state authorities and file formal charges of elder abuse against me, claiming that my mind was rapidly deteriorating and that my paranoid delusions were making me a physical danger to myself and my grandson. He did not stop there. Bradley threatened to use his extensive legal connections to freeze my modest retirement accounts and have me declared legally incompetent. He coldly stated that he would have me locked away in a state-run assisted living facility before the end of the month. Finally, he delivered the most agonizing threat of all. He swore that if I ever tried to investigate his family again, or if I ever spoke a single word of my delusions to the authorities, I would never see Mason for the rest of my life. He promised to erase me entirely from his son's world, leaving me to die alone and forgotten. The sheer cruelty of his words echoed in my ear. He was entirely willing to destroy his own father to protect a massive financial fraud. I was willing to weaponize the legal system to lock me away just to ensure he could continue stealing from a dead man's trust fund. The man on the other end of the line was a complete stranger. He was a monster who had discarded one sick child and was actively exploiting another. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, mourning the son I thought I had raised. Then a deep, undeniable sense of calm washed over me. I realized that arguing with him would only validate his fears and cause him to run further into the shadows. I needed him to feel secure. I needed him to believe that his vicious threats had completely worked. I needed him to confidently walk right into the trap we were setting in New York. So I took a slow, trembling breath, purposefully manufacturing the sound of a defeated, broken old man. I let out a weak, tired chuckle that conveyed absolute surrender. I spoke into the receiver with a frail, shaking voice. I said, "You win, Bradley." I told him I was just too old and entirely too tired for all this terrible drama. I apologized for overstepping my boundaries, claiming I was just a frightened grandfather who had watched too many crime shows on television. I fed his massive ego, telling him that he was right about everything and that I stood no chance against his power. I begged him not to take Mason away from me. I asked him to just keep the boy completely safe, promising that I would stay in my lane and never interfere with his elite life again. The shift in Bradley's demeanor was instantaneous. The frantic panic evaporated, replaced by a sickening, triumphant arrogance. He let out a harsh, patronizing sigh. He told me it was good to hear that I had finally come to my senses. He promised to bring Mason around for the holidays if I managed to behave myself properly. He did not offer any affection or remorse. He simply reveled in his perceived victory. Without another word, he abruptly ended the call. The line went completely dead. I lowered the phone from my ear and placed it gently onto the dark wood of the desk. The pathetic, frail old man vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, sharpened resolve. I looked up at Victor Cole, who was leaning against the filing cabinet with his arms crossed. I then glanced at Jonathan, who sat perfectly still behind his desk, waiting for my next command. The atmosphere in the room shifted from quiet discovery to absolute, undeniable war. We knew exactly how the deception worked. We knew exactly where Bradley and Monica would be on Friday morning. We knew they were planning to use Mason to steal another $1 million from the heavily guarded trust fund, and we were going to stop them. I stood up, my joints no longer aching, my posture completely rigid, energized by a fierce, protective wrath that burned deep within my chest. I looked directly at my corporate attorney. I told Jonathan to get the private jet ready immediately because we were leaving for New York tonight. Then I turned my gaze to the gritty private investigator. I told him to pull whatever strings he had to pull, bribe whoever he needed to bribe, and get my biological grandson Miles out of that state-run Child Protective Services facility today. We were going to a board meeting, and we were taking the absolute undeniable truth right along with us. Jonathan Blake did not waste a single second. While Victor and I stood in his office, the corporate attorney began making aggressive, highly calculated phone calls. He bypassed sluggish family court switchboards and contacted an emergency appellate judge he had known for 20 years. Jonathan presented the irrefutable facts with lethal precision. He outlined the fraudulent safe haven abandonment, the matching hospital birth records, and the newly certified genetic laboratory results, proving that the John Doe currently sitting in the state foster facility was the biological identical twin of my registered ward. Because I already possessed full emergency guardianship status for Mason, Jonathan argued that leaving his identical brother in the custody of a deeply flawed public system for even one more hour constituted gross negligent endangerment. The judge agreed. Within 45 minutes, a heavily stamped emergency ex parte custody order was actively printing out on Jonathan's desk. It granted me immediate, unconditional physical custody of Miles Harrison Caldwell, pending a formal federal investigation into his abandonment. I took the warm paper from the printer, folded it carefully, and placed it inside my breast pocket, right next to my pounding heart. Victor drove his unmarked sport utility vehicle through rain-slicked streets. I sat in the passenger seat, gripping the door handle as he navigated dense afternoon traffic with aggressive efficiency. We left the towering financial district behind us, crossing into the bleak, neglected industrial outskirts where the Child Protective Services intake facility was located. The building was a massive windowless block of gray concrete surrounded by tall chain-link fences. It looked more like a medium-security prison than a safe haven for vulnerable children. The stark, sickening contrast between this cold, sterile holding center and the opulent multi-million-dollar penthouse where Bradley and Monica lived comfortably off this child's stolen identity made my blood boil all over again. They had condemned their own son to this miserable, forgotten place simply to protect their elite social standing and their bloated bank accounts. Victor parked directly in front of the main entrance, leaving the engine running. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the heavy glass doors, my boots echoing loudly against the scuffed linoleum floor. The waiting area was crowded with exhausted social workers and crying children, a chaotic symphony of broken families. I did not wait. I walked straight past the plastic chairs and approached the thick plexiglass partition of the intake desk. I slid the emergency court order through the metal slot. The weary clerk glanced at the document, her eyes widening as she recognized the signature of a high-ranking appellate judge. Within moments, the facility director was summoned to the front. He tried to explain that standard processing protocols usually took several days, but a single chilling glare from Victor, who had stepped up right behind me, instantly silenced his bureaucratic excuses. The director led us down a long, brightly lit corridor, smelling heavily of bleach and institutional food. He unlocked a heavy wooden door at the very end of the hall. Sitting alone at a small plastic table wearing generic, oversized gray sweatpants and a faded white shirt provided by the state was my grandson. He was staring blankly at a blank sheet of paper, a broken crayon resting loosely in his pale hand. He looked incredibly small, entirely lost in a world that had repeatedly thrown him away. I walked slowly into the room and crouched down until I was at his eye level. He flinched slightly, pulling his small shoulders inward, as if anticipating a reprimand. I kept my hands resting calmly on my knees, making absolutely sure I did not crowd his fragile space. I spoke to him in the softest, most steady voice I could summon. I told him his name. I said, "Your name is Miles, and you are my grandson." He slowly raised his dark eyes to meet mine. The profound, heartbreaking confusion in his gaze told me everything. He had spent his entire conscious life without an identity, shuffled from one crowded foster home to another, completely devoid of any lasting affection. I reached out and very gently placed my calloused hand over his small, trembling fingers. I promised him with every single ounce of conviction in my soul that nobody was ever going to throw him away again. I told him that from this moment forward, he was a permanent part of my family, and I would spend the rest of my breathing days protecting him from the monsters who had caused him so much pain. A single tear slipped down his pale cheek. He did not speak, but he tightly gripped my index finger, refusing to let go. I picked him up and carried him out of that miserable building. We climbed into the spacious back seat of Victor's vehicle. As Victor steered us away from the facility, the quiet hum of the engine filled the cabin. Miles sat completely rigid for the first few miles, his small body tense and uncertain. I wrapped my heavy canvas jacket around him, pulling him close to my side. Slowly, the defensive walls he had built around his heart began to lower. He rested his head against my chest, seeking the simple, profound comfort he had been denied his entire life. I wrapped my arm securely around him, resting my chin on the top of his head. The physical weight of this rescued child against my chest was the greatest, most significant achievement of my 72 years on this earth. I had spent 4 decades building commercial structures, but saving this boy's life was the only foundation that truly mattered. I held him closer, swearing a silent oath to make his parents pay for every tear he shed. Victor did not drive us back to my house. The digital dashboard of his vehicle displayed a route heading straight toward the private corporate airfield located just outside the city limits. Jonathan Blake had already arranged for the fast, discreet private jet to be fully fueled and waiting on the tarmac. We were not going to waste time navigating the delays of commercial flights. We arrived at the runway as the sun finally began to set, casting deep, fiery colors across the sky. I carried Miles up the metal steps of the aircraft, ensuring he felt safe and secure in this entirely new environment. Jonathan was already seated inside, organizing a thick stack of legal dossiers containing medical records, safe haven reports, and genetic results. The engines roared to life and we ascended into the darkening sky. Hours later, the massive skyline of New York City appeared through the oval windows of the cabin. The glowing towers looked like a fortress of greed and ambition. We landed on a quiet airstrip late Thursday night. As I carried my sleeping grandson down to the waiting town car, I looked toward the financial district in the distance. The trap was fully set. Bradley and Monica had absolutely no idea that their meticulously crafted empire of lies was about to be utterly demolished by the very child they had discarded. Tomorrow morning, we were walking into that boardroom. Friday morning broke over Manhattan. The city moved with frantic energy, oblivious to the collision of lies and truth about to unfold. I stood in the marble lobby of the Sterling corporate headquarters, wearing a dark suit Jonathan had arranged for me. I firmly held the small, fragile hand of my grandson. Miles was dressed in clean, dark trousers and a soft red sweater, intentionally chosen by Victor to mirror the clothing Bradley forced upon Mason during these audits. He looked handsome, but his body was rigid with anxiety. The towering ceilings and rushing lawyers were alien to a child who had spent his conscious life locked in a bleak state ward. I knelt on the polished marble floor, ignoring the strange looks from passing executives. I looked directly into his dark eyes. I promised him that nobody would ever force him to be invisible again. He gave me a slow nod, his small fingers tightening around my rough hand. Jonathan Blake stood nearby holding his leather briefcase. It contained the legal evidence that would tear my son's fraudulent empire to the ground. Victor Cole stood on my other side, his predatory eyes scanning the massive lobby to ensure Bradley had not stationed private security to intercept us. Jonathan checked his heavy silver wristwatch and gave me a silent, confirming nod. It was exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The mandatory annual audit of the Sterling Generational Trust Fund had officially begun on the 42nd floor of the building. We stepped into the private executive elevator, the steel doors closing silently. The rapid ascent made my stomach drop, but my heart remained entirely calm. I was no longer a confused, heartbroken father seeking affection. I was a man executing a highly calculated structural demolition. The elevator chimed as we arrived at the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal a massive reception area decorated in dark mahogany. Because Jonathan was an elite corporate attorney who had navigated these exact circles, the receptionist did not question our presence. Jonathan simply flashed his credentials and stated, "We were here to provide supplemental documentation for the ongoing Sterling Trust audit." The receptionist nodded respectfully, intimidated by Jonathan's presence, and pointed down a long hallway toward the executive boardroom. We walked slowly down the wide corridor, the thick, luxurious carpet absorbing the heavy sound of our footsteps. As we finally approached the massive, heavy oak doors of the boardroom, I signaled for Jonathan and Victor to stop right where they were. The thick, heavy doors were closed but not completely sealed shut. A tiny sliver of space remained open, allowing the clear voices from inside the cavernous room to drift out into the quiet hallway. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, and listened to the monstrous deception actively playing out right on the other side of the wood. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was incredibly formal, structured, and completely saturated with the arrogance of untouchable wealth. I could clearly hear the deep, authoritative voice of the lead trust executor, reviewing the massive financial portfolios belonging to the Sterling estate. He systematically listed the staggering annual returns of the investments, confirming the exact numeric values of the upcoming distribution checks. I heard Bradley responding, his tone perfectly calibrated to project the image of a humble, responsible father. Then the lead executor shifted his attention to the mandatory physical verification portion of the meeting. He congratulated Bradley and Monica on another highly successful year of managing their firm. He directly addressed my grandson Mason, sitting quietly in one of the leather chairs. The executor cheerfully asked Mason how his private school classes were going this semester and specifically complimented him on his bright red sweater. I heard the perfectly practiced enthusiasm in Bradley's voice as he proudly detailed Mason's academic achievements. He painted a flawless picture of an elite, thriving family life, completely devoid of any struggle or illness. The sheer audacity of his performance made my jaw clench. He was sitting in a room filled with powerful corporate lawyers executing a massive federal fraud without a single drop of sweat forming on his brow. Then came the moment of chilling tension that we had been waiting for. The lead executor paused his formal reading. He stated clearly for the record that the trust required the physical verification of all living beneficiaries before authorizing the final distribution of funds. I heard the crisp rustling of heavy parchment paper as the executor pushed the financial release forms across the polished glass table. He noted that Mason was present and accounted for, but he specifically asked why the second twin was not seated at the table. He asked the multi-million-dollar question in a calm, administrative tone. "Where is Miles?" The silence that followed was brief, but standing out in the hallway, it felt like an absolute eternity. I braced myself for the lie. I knew exactly how they were going to play this sick game. Monica did not hesitate for a single second. Her voice drifted through the narrow gap in the doors, sounding incredibly smooth, confident, and perfectly dripping with manufactured maternal warmth. She chuckled lightly, a sound so artificial it made my stomach turn. She told the trust executor that Miles was just in the restroom washing his hands, and that he would be right out to sign in and say hello. It was a flawless, terrifyingly practiced delivery. She delivered the fraudulent lie with such casual precision that it made my blood run cold. She had likely rehearsed that exact sentence 100 times in the mirror of her luxury penthouse. I pictured the sickening scene unfolding inside the room. Bradley would be sitting there in his tailored suit, flashing his arrogant smile at the powerful attorneys. He was projecting absolute confidence, knowing that he was mere moments away from securing another massive million-dollar payout. I could almost hear the scratch of the expensive fountain pen hovering over the thick check. The blind executors were entirely prepared to release the stolen wealth, waiting only for Monica to excuse herself. Drag Mason into the restroom, swap his sweater, and present him back to the room as the missing twin. I looked down at Miles standing quietly beside me. He was staring at the heavy oak doors, completely unaware that his own mother was currently inside using his name to steal a massive fortune. He squeezed my hand, seeking reassurance. I squeezed his hand back, tightly anchoring him to me. I looked at Victor, who was gritting his teeth in silent disgust. I looked at Jonathan, who simply nodded his head, confirming that the legal trap was now perfectly aligned. Bradley and Monica had officially committed perjury and fraud on the record. They had crossed the point of no return. The buildup of tension in my chest reached an absolute explosive pinnacle. The moment for hiding in the shadows was completely over. I released a slow, measured, deep breath, forever letting go of the father I used to be. I stepped forward, raised my rough, calloused hands, and forcefully pushed the heavy oak doors of the massive boardroom completely wide open, striking the polished mahogany walls with a violent crack that instantly brought the executive meeting to a dead halt. The lead executor stopped mid-sentence, his pen freezing above the million-dollar check. Bradley spun in his leather chair, a furious reprimand forming on his lips. Instead, his mouth fell completely open. He stared at me standing in the threshold, but I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes locked directly on the head of the long glass table. I stepped aside and gave a single nod toward the hallway. Victor Cole walked slowly into the center of the room. He was an intimidating man in a rumpled suit, but his movements were incredibly gentle as he guided the fragile figure walking right beside him. He was firmly holding the hand of my biological grandson, Miles. Miles was not wearing a bright blue sweater or a corduroy jacket. He wore faded gray hospital sweatpants and a thin white shirt provided by the state ward. His bare arms looked frail under the harsh lights of the corporate boardroom. He stepped timidly onto the thick carpet, shrinking behind Victor's protective bulk. His terrified eyes darted around the cavernous room, taking in the towering windows, the polished glass, and the bewildered faces of the powerful attorneys. Then his frantic gaze locked onto the far side of the table. Sitting frozen in a heavy leather chair was Mason. My grandson, wearing the bright red sweater his parents forced him into just an hour ago, stopped breathing. Mason dropped his hands to his lap. He let out a sharp gasp that echoed clearly across the room. He stared with absolute shock at the boy standing by the doorway. For the first time in his life, Mason was looking directly at his exact mirror image. He saw the same dark hair, the same brown eyes, and the same slope of his jaw. The two brothers stared at each other, separated by 30 feet of glass and a lifetime of monstrous deception. The pure confusion of their faces stood in stark contrast to the calculated corruption of the adults surrounding them. The paralyzing silence was shattered by a piercing, hysterical shriek. Monica shot up from her chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. She physically recoiled, scrambling away from the table and pressing her back flat against the floor-to-ceiling window. She clamped both hands over her face, shaking her head aggressively as if trying to reject the reality standing in front of her. She looked at the frail boy as if he were a ghost crawling out of a forgotten grave to drag her down to hell. Bradley did not scream. His reaction was far more visceral and devastating to his polished facade. The confident, untouchable corporate wealth manager instantly evaporated. All the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky white. His eyes widened to an unnatural degree, locked onto the crescent-shaped birthmark on the left ear of the boy near the doorway. Bradley gripped the edge of the glass table so tightly, his knuckles turned pale. He opened his mouth to deploy another calculated lie, but his throat was paralyzed. His chest heaved with shallow, desperate breaths. He knew with terrifying certainty that his multi-million-dollar empire of fraud was completely dead. I ignored my son's panicked hyperventilating. I walked with heavy, deliberate steps straight toward the lead trust executor at the head of the table. I unclasped the thick leather portfolio Jonathan had prepared for me and dropped the massive stack of documents directly onto the glass table. The heavy thud made the surrounding lawyers physically jump in their seats. I looked the lead executor dead in the eye and spoke in a cold, unwavering voice. I told him that I was Harrison Caldwell, the biological grandfather of the two boys currently in this room, and that I was here to ensure the trust was executed with absolute legal accuracy. I reached down and systematically spread the documents across the polished glass, creating an undeniable timeline of pure depravity. I placed the heavily encrypted hospital birth certificates front and center. I pointed out the two distinct names, Mason and Miles, clearly recorded just 14 minutes apart. Next to those certificates, I laid down the dense medical dossier. I highlighted the bright red medical flag, detailing the severe congenital heart defect that required millions of dollars in experimental lifelong care. I watched the lead executor's eyes scan the terrifying medical prognosis. Then I presented the most damning piece of evidence. I slammed the certified redacted police report from the neighboring state directly on top of the medical files. I clearly explained the safe haven abandonment law. I told the board exactly how 7 years ago a 1-year-old infant in severe respiratory distress was dumped on the cold concrete steps of a rural unstaffed fire station. I forced them to look at the genetic laboratory results provided by Victor, legally confirming with a 99.9% certainty that the discarded child described in that police report was the exact same boy standing timidly near the boardroom doors today. The lead executor looked from the certified DNA results to the terrified child in the faded sweatpants, and then finally to the completely paralyzed, sweating man sitting to his left. The atmosphere in the boardroom turned completely toxic. The powerful corporate attorneys sitting around the table were not just shocked. They were deeply, profoundly enraged. They realized they had been systematically manipulated, sitting in this exact room year after year, authorizing massive financial transfers based on a sick, twisted theatrical performance. They had been actively participating in a massive federal crime without even knowing it. I turned to face my son and daughter-in-law. Bradley was trembling uncontrollably, utterly unable to look me in the eye. Monica was still pressed against the glass, sobbing hysterically into her manicured hands. I let the absolute disgust I felt for them radiate through my entire body. I projected my voice so it carried clearly to every single corner of that corporate boardroom, ensuring that every powerful attorney heard the absolute devastating truth. They threw this boy away like garbage to dodge his medical bills, I announced to the room, my voice thundering with 4 decades of hard righteous fury. Then they brought his perfectly healthy brother into this exact room every single year. They used Mason as a dress-up doll, swapping his clothes in a public restroom, to mimic a boy they had left to die in the foster system, all to steal $3.5 million of your trust. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and deadly. The lead executor did not ask a single solitary question. He did not demand further explanation. He simply looked at Bradley with a cold, terrifying emptiness, slowly reached his hand beneath the edge of his heavy mahogany desk, and firmly pressed a silent emergency security button. The faint electronic buzz of the hidden security mechanism echoed softly under the heavy mahogany desk. The lead executor slowly withdrew his hand and leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, his face a mask of absolute unforgiving granite. He did not say a single word to my son. He did not offer any legal courtesy or professional grace. He simply folded his hands together and waited. Bradley stared at the space where the $1 million check had rested just moments before, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He looked like a man who had stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for the inevitable bone-crushing impact. Monica was still pressed flat against the floor-to-ceiling glass window. Her designer trench coat wrinkled her face, buried in her trembling hands. The quiet in the boardroom was no longer just tense. It was actively suffocating. I stood my ground at the head of the table, placing myself firmly between the corporate attorneys and the two innocent boys. Victor Cole moved silently to my right, positioning his broad shoulders to block any sudden, desperate movements my son might attempt to make. Jonathan Blake calmly closed his leather briefcase, the sharp click of the brass latches echoing loudly, like the final nail being hammered into a coffin. We did not have to wait long. Less than 2 minutes after the executor triggered the silent alarm, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open for the second time that morning. It was not the standard building security guards who stepped through the wide threshold. It was a highly coordinated team of 6 federal agents belonging to the Financial Crimes Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jonathan had meticulously prearranged their presence in the lobby, providing them with the certified genetic results and the hacked hospital records hours before the meeting even began. The agents entered the cavernous room with swift, terrifying efficiency. They wore dark suits and stern, unyielding expressions, their gold badges gleaming under the bright overhead lights. The lead agent stepped directly toward the center of the glass table, his sharp eyes locking instantly onto Bradley and Monica. He held up a thick stack of federal arrest warrants. He announced their full legal names in a loud, commanding voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. He stated that they were both being placed under immediate federal arrest for massive wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, grand larceny, and the reckless criminal abandonment of a critically ill minor. The absolute, paralyzing panic finally broke. The polished elite illusion that Bradley and Monica had spent years meticulously crafting shattered into 1,000 jagged, irreparable pieces. Bradley stumbled backward, his expensive leather chair tipping over and crashing loudly onto the thick carpet. He threw his hands up in a frantic defensive gesture, completely abandoning the calm corporate persona he had always used to manipulate the world. He turned his wide, terrified eyes toward his wife. In that single desperate moment, he proved exactly how hollow his loyalty truly was. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Monica and began to frantically shout his excuses to the advancing federal agents. He screamed that the entire fraudulent scheme had been her exclusive idea. He yelled that it was her father who had created the restrictive trust fund and that she had forced him to abandon the sick child to secure the massive inheritance. I tried to throw the mother of his children completely under the bus to save his own skin. Monica's sobbing abruptly stopped. Her hands dropped from her face, revealing a twisted, vicious expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged forward with explosive speed. She did not use words to defend herself. She raised her hand and delivered a brutal, resounding slap directly across Bradley's face. The sharp, cracking sound of her palm striking his cheek echoed violently off the polished mahogany walls. She screamed that he was a pathetic, cowardly liar, reminding him hysterically that he had driven the car to the rural fire station that night. The sophisticated high society couple instantly devolved into screaming, vicious criminals tearing each other apart in the center of the elegant corporate boardroom. They cursed and blamed one another, completely ignoring the fact that their two biological sons were standing just a few feet away, watching their absolute moral destruction unfold in real time. I did not want Mason and Miles to witness the ugly, pathetic downfall of the people who brought them into this world. I turned my back on the chaotic scene and dropped to one knee, placing myself entirely between the boys and their screaming parents. I reached out and gently pulled Mason and Miles against my chest, wrapping my heavy arms securely around their small, trembling shoulders. I pressed their faces into my dark suit jacket, shielding their innocent eyes from the horrific sight of the federal agents physically subduing their mother and father. I whispered softly into their ears, promising them over and over again that they were completely safe, that the bad things were finally ending, and that nobody was ever going to hurt them or separate them again. They clung to me with desperate strength, two identical boys finally united in the protective embrace of a man who actually valued their lives more than money. Behind me, the chaotic shouting abruptly shifted into the cold, mechanical reality of the law. I heard the distinct, heavy metallic clicking of steel handcuffs locking securely around wrists. The federal agents loudly read the Miranda rights, their professional voices cutting sharply through Monica's hysterical sobbing and Bradley's frantic, breathless pleading. I slowly stood up, keeping the two boys safely positioned behind my legs. I turned around to watch the final conclusion of their monstrous greed. Bradley was being forcefully marched toward the heavy oak doors by two tall agents. His expensive suit was torn, his tie was crooked, and his face was slick with terrified sweat. As they dragged him past the glass table, his desperate eyes locked onto mine. He dug his heels into the thick carpet, trying to resist the forward momentum of the agents. He looked at me with an expression of absolute pathetic desperation. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking with genuine agonizing terror as the agents pulled him forward. "You have to do something. You have to stop them. Please, Dad, we are family. You cannot just stand there and let them take me away to prison." I stood perfectly still, looking at the miserable, broken man I had raised. I felt absolutely no pity, no sorrow, and no lingering paternal instinct to save him from the severe consequences of his own cold, calculated actions. He had made his choice long ago. I looked him dead in the eye and slowly delivered my final, unwavering response. "You threw your son away to save your lifestyle," I said, my voice cold, deep, and echoing with absolute finality across the quiet room. "Now the state is going to throw you away forever, and I will personally make absolutely certain that you never see these two innocent boys ever again." The heavy oak doors swung shut behind the federal agents, sealing the fate of my son and his wife. The chaotic echoes of their desperate, pathetic screaming slowly faded down the long executive hallway, leaving the massive corporate boardroom in absolute stunning silence. The powerful attorneys seated around the polished glass table remained entirely motionless. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the criminal deception that had just been exposed within their own fortified walls. Jonathan Blake calmly adjusted his tailored suit jacket and began distributing the certified legal documents to the visibly shaken board of executors. He ensured that every single piece of undeniable evidence regarding the fraudulent safe haven abandonment and the subsequent financial theft was permanently entered into the official trust records. I did not care about the money at that specific moment. My only focus was the two terrified young boys standing tightly against my legs. I knelt down on the thick carpet and wrapped my arms around Mason and Miles, holding them firmly until their small bodies stopped trembling. I carried them out of that building and never looked back. 6 months have passed since that incredible, devastating morning in New York. I am sitting on this wooden porch of my home, a warm mug of black coffee resting in my rough, calloused hands. The gentle morning breeze carries the fresh scent of blooming pine trees across the yard. The heavy legal dust has finally settled over our family. The justice system moved with a swift, merciless precision that absolutely crushed the polished illusion Bradley and Monica had spent years carefully building. Because Jonathan had meticulously provided the federal investigators with impenetrable forensic evidence, there was no lengthy, drawn-out trial. The Financial Crimes Unit completely dismantled their offshore accounts and seized their luxury properties. Faced with an overwhelming mountain of indisputable biological and financial proof, they were forced to accept a harsh plea deal. Bradley and Monica were both sentenced to serve 15 years in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the severe criminal abandonment of a critically ill minor. They lost their freedom, their status, and their stolen wealth. They will spend the next decade and a half locked in small concrete cells, completely stripped of the corporate arrogance that fueled their monstrous greed. The board of executors overseeing the Sterling Generational Trust Fund moved just as decisively. They were profoundly horrified that their strict legal protocols had been so easily manipulated by a simple change of clothing in a public restroom. To rectify their massive oversight, they immediately petitioned the federal family court to formally restructure the management of the estate. The judge granted me full permanent legal custody of both Mason and Miles. Furthermore, recognizing my crucial role in exposing the millions of dollars in theft, the court officially appointed me as the sole legal conservator of their financial trust. I do not touch a single penny of that money for myself. My own contracting pension is more than enough to sustain my quiet lifestyle. Every single dollar generated by that massive estate is now heavily monitored and strictly reserved entirely for the health, education, and future security of my 2 grandsons. The most significant victory, however, was not the financial restitution or the criminal convictions. The true victory is currently unfolding right in front of my eyes on the bright green grass of my backyard. I take a slow sip of my coffee and watch Mason throw a worn leather baseball across the lawn. The ball lands with a soft thud in the waiting glove of his identical twin brother. Miles catches it gracefully and throws it right back, a bright, genuine smile illuminating his young face. When I first pulled Miles out of that bleak, underfunded state foster facility 6 months ago, he was a fragile, terrified shell of a child. His rare congenital heart defect had been completely neglected, leaving him dangerously weak and constantly exhausted. He could barely walk across the living room without losing his breath. But with the massive financial resources of the trust fund finally unlocked and legally available, we immediately secured the absolute best pediatric cardiologists in the entire country. 2 months ago, Miles underwent a highly complex, top-tier surgical procedure to permanently repair the severe structural anomalies in his heart. The experimental medical treatments that his parents had deemed too expensive were completely successful. The recovery process was undeniably grueling. There were many long, sleepless nights spent sitting beside his hospital bed, holding his small hand and softly humming that obscure family lullaby to keep his night terrors at bay. But he fought through the pain with a fierce, quiet resilience that constantly amazed me. Today, the doctors have given him a completely clean bill of health. His cheeks are full of color. He has gained healthy weight. The terrified mute boy I found shivering at the highway patrol station is entirely gone. He talks constantly now, his voice a bright, energetic mirror to his brother. The bond between the 2 boys formed almost instantaneously. Despite spending the first 8 years of their lives completely separated by a monstrous lie, they connected with an innate, unbreakable biological harmony. They share a bedroom, they share their toys, and they share a deep, unspoken understanding that they are finally safe. I lean back against the sturdy wooden frame of my porch chair and watch them laugh together as the baseball arcs through the warm morning air. For 40 years, I worked as a commercial contractor. I poured countless tons of concrete, erected towering steel frames, and built massive structures designed to withstand the harshest elements. I measured my success by the height of the buildings I completed and the profit margins I generated. But sitting here today, watching the 2 halves of my family finally made whole, I realize how profoundly wrong I was. The greatest, most important thing I have ever built in my 72 years of life was not a towering skyscraper or a sprawling corporate complex. The greatest thing I ever built was a safe, unbreakable foundation for these two innocent boys. I provided a home where they are valued for their existence, not for their financial utility. I know the road ahead will still present challenges. Healing from the profound psychological trauma inflicted by their own parents will be a long, ongoing journey for both Mason and Miles. There will inevitably be questions I cannot easily answer and emotional scars that will require immense patience to mend. But they will never have to face those challenges alone. They will grow up knowing that they are fiercely protected, deeply loved, and entirely irreplaceable. Bradley and Monica believed that money could erase their sins and buy them a flawless reality. They failed to understand that a life built on a foundation of cruel deception will inevitably collapse under its own unnatural weight. I lower my mug and smile as Miles tackles Mason into the soft grass, their joyous laughter echoing loudly across the yard. The dark storm that brought them together has finally passed, leaving behind an undeniable legacy of truth and redemption. Blood may make you related, but pure integrity, sacrifice, and unconditional love make you a true family. Greed is a blinding poison. It convinces weak people that money can replace morality and that lies can outrun the truth. But a foundation built on deceit will always collapse. In the end, the darkest secrets we bury will eventually rise to the surface, demanding justice. Real wealth is not found in trust funds, offshore accounts, or luxury lifestyles. It is found in protecting the innocent, standing up for what is right, and having the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. If this true story made your blood boil and your heart cheer, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever seen greed completely destroy someone you trusted? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I will see you in the next life story.